closely centered, and we will give it a modifier of modifier fill max width. In this column, we will then have our spacer, so our invisible spacing, where we give it a modifier of fill max height, but for the fraction, we choose 0.15f. So the column actually spans over the whole screen now, not just about this, and not just over this blurred image section. So that was wrong, sorry. But it spans over the whole screen. And since 15% of our screen are just half the height of our 30% image height here, this will just offset the image by exactly half the height here. And then below this, we can have an elevated card to draw this image on, which gets a modifier of modifier with a fixed width of, let's say, 200 dp. So that will be the width of our book cover, and an aspect ratio of 2:3. We give this a rounded corner shape of 8 dp corner radius, some colors, where we can say card defaults, card colors, or actually elevated card colors it is, where the container color is just transparent, colored transparent, since we don't want to have a real container here. This is just used to show off a little bit of shadow and also be able to draw content on top of that, like our favorite button. Then the elevation is something we want to override, where we can say card defaults, elevated card elevation, where we say the default elevation is, let's say, 15 dp. And then we can give this card some content, which on the one hand will of course be our book cover. So here we can actually also make this an animated content, which is a composable that allows us to animate between different composables based on a certain target state, which will be our image load result. And then in here, we get this result and we can add our when expression here. So depending on what that result is, if it's null, we want to show our circular progress indicator for now, but later on our pulse animation. And otherwise, we want to draw our image again with our painter. But here we need to check if it's successful or not again. So if the, what's it called, result is success is true. Oh no, it's actually non-nullable in this case. So if this is successful, we use the painter, and otherwise the painter resource, and we pass our error image again. So here ras drawable book error. Content description can again be a string resource, ras string book cover. We have a modifier, which is modifier.fill max size. So I want to fill the whole size of our outer card, and then give this a background of transparent. So in no cases we have any background of this book cover, but really just the image itself. The content scale also is important here, which again has the same rule as for the list screen, that if this result was successful, we make this content scale crop, and otherwise we say fit. Like this. And actually this image also goes in a box, since we want to also now draw the icon button here in the bottom right corner. So let's put this in a box, and then here below this image, we will have our icon button. When we click this, we say on favorite click. We say the colors of this. Oh no, we actually adjust this for the icon itself. What else do we need here? The modifier, since we need to align this in the bottom right. So we say align bottom end, and we want to give this little glowy background, so it's better seeable even on a red cover. And this works with a gradient. So it's in the end just a yellow gradient towards transparent. And we can do this with a brush by saying brush.radial gradient. So we want a circular gradient in this case, where the colors for the gradient are a list of, on the one hand, from sand yellow, from the center of the circle, towards color.transparent. And the radius is, let's say, 70 pixels. Inside of this icon button, we then draw our icon with the image vector icons default favorite, favorite border actually. Oh no, that actually depends on whether we mark this as a favorite or not. So if isFavorite is true, then we want to use the filled favorite, actually make this explicit here with icons filled favorite, and otherwise icons outlined favorite border. We want to set the tint of this to color.red, And we want to set, I need to give this a content description, which is also now dependent on whether we mark this as a favorite or not. If this is a favorite, we say string resource, string, remove from favorites, because if we marked it as a favorite, clicking it would remove it again. So always remember that these content descriptions are mainly used for things like screen readers that would read what would happen when we click on this button. And if it's marked as a favorite, we would remove it. Otherwise, we would add it. Mark as favorite. Like this. And that should be it for this blurred image background. The last thing that's missing is that we actually use our composable lambda, so we can also draw the remaining stuff here. And this composable lambda needs to come in this column after this elevated card. So let's highlight this, go down here, and this should be the place where we now want to draw the content. I think it's quite a long composable, and we could argue about extracting certain parts into separate composables, but I think it's okay. Might want to use this modifier here as well for the box. Modifier is modifier, but we don't need to change this in any way. Let's try this out. Let's launch this, and we should hopefully see the same as on the left, just without these texts here and the synopsis. So launching this, there we go, loading our little books. Here we are. If we click on that, oh, that looks pretty cool, I think. The book cover is a little bit larger than I had it in the preview, which I don't know why from the top of my head. Let's click on go back. That at least works. Why is this larger? So the elevated card has an aspect ratio of 2:3. And the issue is that this should be a height. So we want this to be 200 dp high, but not wide. But of course, feel free to adjust this. If you like this size of the book cover, I think it looks decent, especially with a shadow here, then do so. But oops, let's relaunch this now with a height of 200 dp, and it should look similar as I had it. Let's search for a different book. Harry Potter again. Okay, let's use, I don't know, that one. And yeah, that's how it looks like. Pretty cool, I think. I think it could be slightly larger, actually, when I think about it. What if we make this a height of 270, maybe? Let's try that. There we go, Kotlin programming. I think this looks decent. So obviously we need to make this thing scrollable, or rather the section below here. Like the best case would probably that we implement somehow that we have a collapsing toolbar, but that would also make this video way too long, and that's rather something for a premium course of mine. I think, yeah, it's slightly too large. Let's make this 230 and that'll be good. You could, of course, also make this dependent on the actual device size and so on, so to show a larger cover on desktops than on mobile, but I think this will be fine. So now we can use this in our book detail screen, and what we put in here will then show up below. So if we have our hello world text here, launching this one last time before we go on with this UI here, if we do this, then it will show up just after our book cover. I think this looks really cool. So we can go in here and say, if there is actually a selected book, so if state book is this nullable? State book, yeah, it is. If this is not null, then we show our actual book data. This will be shown in a column, of course, which takes in a modifier. Modifier is modifier fill max width. Again, we want to limit the width a little bit on larger screen sizes. We say max is 700 dp. Alt enter. Within it needs to be within like this. We give this some padding, so it's not immediately below the book cover, but just pad it a little bit. Let's say vertical padding is 16 dp as well as horizontal padding. I mean, that should be a bit more, 24 dp. And we can give this a vertical scroll, passing in remember scroll state. And then we should be able to scroll this column here so that the book cover won't be scrollable, but the content's down here. And everything in there should be centered horizontally. Alignment, center horizontally. So I've opened the sample app as a reference again, so we can now build this remaining part of the screen. First of all, want to have a title text, which will be the state book title. It will have a style of material theme, typography, headline small, and we set the text align to center. Not snap position again, text align center. We can copy paste this also for the description. Actually, the author it is state book authors. And since those are multiple authors, we could say join to string, which will take the list of authors and concatenate them with a comma in between. Or if you say you just want to highlight the first authors, like the main author, you can also say authors that first. This will have title medium as a style, also text align center, I would say. Then below this text, we have a row of 2 of our chips for rating and pages. So row modifier is modifier, add some vertical padding of, let's say, 8 dp. And we want to add horizontal arrangement of arrangement that's spaced by 16 dp. So we just want to have 16 dp of spacing between these chips. And in here, we can then have these chips. So if there is a rating, if state book average rating exists, we want to have our titled content where the title is our rating. No, actually not the rating, but this is the description for the rating. So string resource, res string rating. The modifier is not necessary here, so we can just open the composable content in which we will have our chip, or book chip, how do we call it? Book chip, yeah. And here for this one specifically, we show the actual rating text. We can again round it. So we say rating multiplied by 10 divided by 10.0. Put this actually in a string like this. And but after that, we want to show an icon for our little star. Image vector icons default star. Give this a content description of null and a tint of sand yellow. Same thing we now do for our pages. So state book pages, number pages, dot let pages or page count. We can have the same type of titled content, copy paste it here. The title here will be pages. The text will be page count to string. Here we don't need to round anything. And the icon is not necessary for the page count. All right, then in the next row, after this row, we want to show all of our languages. So you can see that for books that have a lot of languages, like Harry Potter again, we will see all of these languages here when clicking on this right here. So lots of languages, and we want to show these all, if you want at least. So we will have a languages text, and then we will make use of a so-called flow row. So just a row that arranges all these chips in a row-like fashion. But if they get too wide to fit in a single row, then these will jump to the next line until we looped over all of them. So below this row here, we want to have a check if state book languages is not empty. So if we have any languages to show, then we say we again have our titled content, where the title this time is a string resource, res string languages. Modifier is again one with a bit of vertical padding, so vertical 8 dp. And then we have our actual content. So this is now the titled content that shows this languages text together with the content, which is this flow row. So flow row, give it a horizontal arrangement of arrangement center, so that in the last row everything will be centered. We can give this a modifier of modifier wrap content size, also pass in center here, and then simply loop over all of our books, all of our languages. So state book languages for each language. We have our book chip, which shows the text, so the language, actually that uppercase. We can give this style as well. Style, material, theme, typography, body medium this will be. And these chips specifically will be small chips. So the size will be chip size .small. And we add a bit of padding between each chip by saying modifier padding 2dp. So with that, we just achieved this tiny spacing between the chips. The flow row is marked as an error because this is experimental. So we want to alt enter and opt into this experimental layout API. And then below this languages section, after this if statement, where is it? Here. We will have our description, so our synopsis. The description we still need to load from the API, but we can already draw the headline for that. So text, that's a string resource. ras string synopsis. The style will be material theme, typography, headline, actually title large. Title large. Give this a modifier of modifier dot align. Align this to the start of our column, so it's all left aligned here. Alignment dot start. Give this some padding. Actually, after we say fill max width, give this some padding. Specifically top padding of 24dp, so that we have this spacing here, as well as bottom padding of 8dp, so at the very bottom here. And then we do have our description text. So text is equal to if the state book description, do we already have that field? Yeah. If that is not null, then we say the text will simply be the book description. If it is null, which it will be in all of our cases right now because we didn't yet implement the API or the endpoint to fetch that. If it is null, then we say string resource ras string no, what did I call it? Book description unavailable. This is foldable. If we do this, yeah, we can do that. That's a bit better, I think. Oh no, let's actually keep this because some of these descriptions are actually blank. So let's check for is null or blank without the null check here. And in that case, move this in here. Sorry, that's a bit of a mess here. But this way, it's now better. So if it's blank, if there is no description and we just got an empty string from the API, then we also want to show it's unavailable, and otherwise we show it. For the style here, we can say material theme, typography, body medium. The text align here, I would say, is justify, so that it always fills the whole width here. I think this looks decent. The color of this depends on whether we have a valid description or not. So if state book description is null or blank again, we will use a color like color black, but we say the alpha is only 40% and otherwise just color black. And the modifier of this one will be modifier, give it vertical padding of 8dp. And I think that should be it. Something we might also want to do is want to show a progress indicator here when we load. So if state is loading, then we say, okay, we have a box, modifier fill max width and weight 1f. So we just fill the remaining height of our screen and we center the progress indicator here. And then simply pass that in. If we're not loading, then it really depends on the description that we've loaded. Okay, let's launch this. This should contain almost all of our UI for the screen now. So what's missing is, of course, on the one hand, the functionality for loading the descriptions, and on the other hand, the functionality to mark books as a favorite. Let's click on a book, and there we go. The rating looks very off, but other than that, it's a bit weird that we don't see the progress indicator here for the description, because we are actually loading by default, I think. So book detail view model, let's take a look at the state. This is true. So I don't know why that isn't showing. What if we just put the progress indicator in here and comment this out? Let's also take a look at the rating very quickly. Book app chip. I think what we could do to easily fix this is, like on the one hand, we could of course put these in a row, which we should have done, but I would say in most cases, if we have multiple composers in here, these will be arranged in a row anyways. So what we could do is, we could make this chip content actually extend a row scope. So we automatically provide this row scope by putting this in a row here. We can say vertical alignment is alignment center vertically, like this, and maybe also horizontally, arrangement center, and then that should be fixed. Let's also check the description issue. There we go. Kotlin programming. Now we see the progress indicator. I think this is okay. And this won't hide in this case because we never update it to false, which is what we will do next. So loading the description and then marking things as favorites. So we don't yet have any database implementation, of course. That is what will come last. Let's spend time on working on fetching the description. Let's quickly actually take a look at Harry Potter again. If that Now also works, yeah, multiple languages. That looks decent. We can scroll here, as you can see. Very cool, very cool. We slowly get towards a working app. So yeah, as I said, next up is the book detail endpoint, fetch the description, merge that into our book, and then be able to show that. And lastly, be able to also have some favorite books here, which we also still have to do. So let's think about how we implement the book detail endpoint to fetch the description of a book, because that's really the only piece of data that's missing for a book, at least for our app here. And it might sound easier than it will actually be, because as I already said, the API design is really bad. And what I mean with that is that if we take a look here, I have prepared 2 of these detail responses. So you can see the endpoint is openlibrary.org/works, so to find out a specific book, and then we pass in the book ID.json. And I've prepared 2 of these. And if you take a look at the JSON response, then we will notice, okay, here's the description that we're looking for this particular book. All the other fields we don't care about here for this endpoint. So you can see that description is simply a string. However, if we take a look at the different endpoint, like it's the same endpoint but a different book, then the description is suddenly a JSON object. So it's not a string anymore, but the string is inside of this JSON object, hidden behind this value field. So for some books, the API responds the description as a real JSON object, and for some other books, it responds that as a simple string. And this really shows me that this API was not designed for mobile development, since in mobile development, we typically work with type safety when it comes to parsing JSON data. And a JSON structure like this is easy to parse if you're using JavaScript and you're building a website or so, but it's terrible to parse this on a mobile environment. Still, that is something we have to work with, and that is also something you will often face in your daily life as a mobile developer, that you just have to work around such bad API design, since that's in the end what's given to you and you have to make the best out of it. So I think this will still be a good practice, how we can work around that. So we can start by again going to our book feature, since that's obviously part of that. Going in data, DTO, because now we want to define a different DTO, data transfer object, or Kotlin data class representation of what we want to parse this JSON into. And we call this book work DTO, for example. This will be a data class. And here we will really just want to define the description and ignore all other strings. The description is still nullable, so even though some books have that as a JSON object, some other books have it as a string, there's still also books that don't have a description at all. And we would need to annotate this with serializable again, but by default, if we would just do it like this, this would not work. It would only work for those book work DTOs, for those JSON responses where the description is really a string field. But if it's an object, then the serializer by default won't know that it needs to find the description inside of this object. So what we need to do in order to work around this issue is we need a custom serializer. So if we take a look here in this annotation and we open parentheses, and then we actually have this width parameter, which is a k serializer. So we can say that this book work DTO specifically should be serialized and deserialized with a different type of serializer where we can then define our own logic. And we want to create this here in DTO as well, called book work DTO serializer. This can be an object, and it will inherit or implement this k-serializer interface, which needs to consist of the type of object we want to serialize or deserialize. Then we can hit Command I here to override these 3 fields and functions. And on the one hand, we need to define this serial descriptor. So this really just gives the serializer kind of an outline of which fields we're actually looking for to deserialize. And we can actually just set this equal to build class serial descriptor with the serial name, so that is the class name, book work DTO. We could also, I think, give this the a dynamic name dependent on our DTO. So this would also adjust if we would rename this. This should work with book work DTO : class simple name. I think this is the simple name of the class as it was declared in the source code, or null if the class has no name. And apparently this can return null, which it shouldn't, because our class definitely has a name, so we can assert this here. And then we can open a block of code here in which we specify those elements. So those are now the JSON field elements that we care about here. In our case, that's really just the description. It needs to match the field of the JSON field, and we need to specify what type of object that is. In this case, it's a nullable string. We need to Alt Enter here to import this element, and then we also don't have any more errors. And now this serializer gives us a deserialize function, which just gives us this decoder, which you can now use to step by step decode those fields that we care about and return these as our desired object, the book work DTO, and a serialize function. So if we would have a book work DTO and you would want to push that to the API, for example, then we have to take this Kotlin object and serialize it as JSON. And that is what we define with the serialize function. This actually we don't need because we only fetch bookwork DTOs. Still, for the sake of completeness, I would implement this as well. It's really super simple for this one. Just the deserialize logic is a bit more difficult. So here for this deserialize function, what we want to do is we want to set this equal to decoder.decode structure and passing in this descriptor here. So this is just how we initiate this decoding process here of the JSON that was returned. And in here, we then want to have a var description, which is our nullable description. We set this to null initially, since at this point we don't yet know the value of that. And then we want to have a while true loop. So while true loop, in which we check, or we say val index is equal to decode element at index. This function now comes from this decode structure block. So we're just now trying to decode this whole object by passing in this descriptor again. And then this function returns a specific index, which corresponds to the elements that we've declared in here. So in our case, we just care about a single field. So we only care about the index 0 because this is the first element here. If we would also want to decode something else, like the title, and we would have the title here, then if this returns index 1, we would know, okay, we're talking about the title field. In this case, if it returns index 0, we know we're talking about description. And that's all we care about in this case. So we can remove the title again. Just that you know that this index does not refer to the actual index of the JSON response, like the order of the field, but to the order that we've specified up here. And if this index is now equal to 0, that means we actually decoded this description field, which can now be a string or a JSON object. We can now define this logic to decode this, these two cases in here. First of all, we need a JSON decoder, which is equal to our decoder as a JSON decoder. If this is not castable here to a JSON decoder, that means the response was not in JSON. So in that case, we can throw a serialization exception where we say this decoder only works with JSON. And now we can say val element is equal to JSON decoder dot decode JSON element. And a JSON element here is really just anything relating to JSON. So this could be a JSON object. This could be such an object here in curly braces. This could be a simple field, like just a string. This could be a list, like here. So this is what we need to check next. So we can say description is equal to if this element is actually a JSON object. So we're talking about a real object that we need to deserialize here, which would be the case, again, here if the description is an actual object. Then that means if it is an object, the description should be assigned from this object specifically with the value field. So we go back. Here we can then say decoder that JSON dot decode from JSON element. Since we have a JSON element here and we want to now decode that whole object into our own DTO class again, which we have to create. So here in DTO, we say description DTO, which is a data class, serializable, and this actually contains the field value, also nullable. Let's leave this like that. And I think this is actually non-nullable if we do have this description DTO. So if we actually have a whole JSON object the API responds with, then the description exists. Just if we don't have this response type of an object, then it might not exist. So our goal is now to go back to our serializer. We say we want to decode from JSON elements, so from this one, where we now know, okay, this is actually a JSON object. So we definitely currently have to deal with this certain type of JSON element structure, JSON object structure. So we need to pass that we are actually working with a description DTO. The element here is our JSON element, and the deserializer for that is our description DTO serializer. And this will now just normally decode this element here into such a description DTO. But since our description is a string and not a description DTO, we need to refer to that value. This is now the value that we got from the API here. So this specific string. However, if we are working with a plain string, so if the description is directly here as a string, that is now what we need to put in the else case. So here, if it's a JSON object, we now have this logic. If it's not a JSON object, specifically else if this element is now a JSON primitive. So for example, a string, an integer, anything like that. And the element is also a string, so only then we know we are dealing with a valid description, then we can simply say element.content, which will be the actual value of the description field. And in all other cases, so else, if it's not a JSON object or a JSON primitive, or it's simply not a string, maybe it does not exist or so, then we will just assign null. Okay, furthermore, here in this when expression, we want to catch the case of composite decoder decode none. So that means we're just done with deserializing. In that case, we can break out of our loop. And in all other cases, we can throw an exception, unexpected index or so, and we pass in the current index. So now we just assigned a real value to our description. So after this loop, once we break out of that, when we went through all of our indices, we can go down here and return at decode structure our actual book work DTO with our description. So this is now our custom serialization or deserialization logic. And you can see it's quite a pain to make this work with a single field like this. So if you are working together with a backend team and you are actually in communication, so you kind of own the API as well in your company, then talk to them that they don't do this because this is really something mobile developers hate. And web developers typically have no idea that we have this type safety here in the mobile world, and they can just make easy type checks with JavaScript. They can just check, okay, use this field if it's not null, and otherwise use this field and then decode it as an object. This is much easier in JavaScript, but in Android or also iOS, things work differently. For the serialize function, we now get a value, a book work DTO, which we now have to serialize into this encoder, so as a JSON string. And this is really easy. We can just say value description dot let. So if that exists, we just say encode string, actually encoder, encode string, actually string element, but we do also need to call encoder dot encode structure again. So just the opposite of decode structure. Pass in the descriptor like this. Then we can say encode string element, there it is. Pass in our descriptor, the index is 0 and the value is simply it. So our description. But as I said, the serialize function won't ever be called in our app anyways, since we don't need to serialize such an object back to JSON again, since we don't need to push that to the API in any case. Still, I also wouldn't leave this unimplemented, because if you later need this, then it would lead to issues and you would first of all be confused why. Okay, now we have the serializer, which is still unused. So we need to go to our bookwork DTO and say with bookwork DTO serializer ;class. So we say this particular serializable class should now be serialized and deserialized with our custom serializer. All right, now we're actually settled to add the endpoint to fetch a bookwork by going to our network remote book data source. And in here, we simply add another function. So we say get book details, where we say we pass in the book work ID. And we then get back a result of our book work DTO and data error remote again. And now we can hit on this arrow to go to our implementation, our Cato remote data source, where we now have to implement this. So here we can just have our get book details function, where we can just say return safe call again. And in here, we use our HTTP client to make a GET request with the URL string. What did we call it? Base URL. Actually, let's have it like that. Base URL /works /bookwork ID.json. This is exactly the endpoint I've shown you here. So if we take a look again, you can see open library /works. This is the bookwork ID.json. And then we get this type of data. So you can see how easy that now is, thanks to this save call function, which automatically parses the result of this call into a result class, so that we can perfectly work with that. We should also be very explicit about the type here. Actually, it doesn't accept that for some reason. This is actually the place I'm noticing that takes the specific type of data we expect. So sorry, we should specify this here. Bookwork DTO. And probably also here with a search response DTO. Able to fetch book details. We can go to our default book repository to also extend this one here with a function for that. And since in our case, we really just care about the description of a book, and that's also all we fetch in the book work DTO, let's call this function in the book repository that we also expose to the presentation layer, get book description. Pass in the book ID, and that gives us a result of a string and a data error. Here I'm not actually using data error remote, because later on we might also fetch this book description from our local database. It could also very well be a data error local. Searching books only works via the API, so it's clear that if we have an error, it must be a remote error. But to get the book description, this happens on the detail screen. And if there's already this book in our favorites, then we can load the description immediately from our DB. So back to book default repository, get a book description. Here we can now return if, or actually not if, we can just return our remote book data source dot get book details, pass in our book ID, and then that gives us a result of book work DTO. We need it as a result of a string, so we can simply map this to the description. And that's how we fetch a book description. So we can now go to our book detail view model. We can then add a function down here, fetch book description, for example, view model scope.launch, since it's a suspending call. And here we say book repository, or did I just call it? Oh, don't we have a reference to that yet? Oh, okay. Still need to inject this here. Book repository, make sure to use the abstraction. And then we say book repository, get book description, pass in the book ID, which you can get from our navigation arguments instantly after navigating. So we want to use saved state handle here, saved state handle, since that is what allows us to actually get navigation arguments also in the view model. So this is really nothing else than a persistent map of items or a bundle of items where we say, okay, this key is mapped to this value, book ID is mapped to this specific ID, for example. And yeah, Android will just pass the navigation arguments over there as well, or rather KMP, we're not on Android here. And then we can pass this down here by saying book ID is saved state handle to route, specifically our book detail route, and we refer to the ID. We can also cut this out, have it available as a global field, because we might need this multiple times here on the screen. But this way we just get a type save ID, which we can then pass here, ID or book ID, and on success. So if this API call was successful, we simply update our state.update, it.copy, and we just say our already loaded book is it.book.copy, and we update its description with with the description we fetched here. Like this, that's the description. We also want to set isLoading to false now, and then we can call this function again in our onStart function of our state flow. So we can say onStart, so really same reasons as why we did it for the list screen. So here we can say fetch book description, and we say state in view model scope, shearing started while subscribed with 5 seconds and underscore stated value as the default state. I think this should be ready to try out whether we are able to load descriptions or not. I will launch this. Take a look on this device here. I think, what's complaining here? Unresolved reference. Is that an issue? Apparently not, still launched, so that was a bug. Here we have our list of books, and now the magic happens when we click on a book, and it has description unavailable, because for this book I think it also is not available. But let's look for a book like Harry Potter again, which certainly has a description. There we go, Harry Potter, and clicking on one here. And yes, we did fetch the description. Very cool, there it is. If we go back and click on another book, also description, and so on. So this seems to work just fine. We can also look for actually the same books that I opened up here. So this 48 Laws of Power, for example, had a description where it was directly a string, so that we certainly also test this type, 48 Laws of Power. There we go. Click this. Yes, it also loads the description for this book. Amazing. So next step is to implement our favorite function, which we currently don't have. So if we click here, nothing happens. So we need to add a database, a local database with room that we can save the books that we've marked as a favorite. And as a last thing, we also still need to implement certain animations, like the polls animation that I've shown you. But other than that, we are done. So let's get to the database first and then the animations. For the database, I will go back to our book data package, obviously. And here we should probably just have a database package in which you first of all create a book entity. So an entity is really just the equivalent of a DTO, just for local storage. So in the end, just a database table. We're going to make use of room here, which is completely KMP compatible, in which we need to annotate these entities with entities. So room knows, that's actually an entity, that's a table. And then in here, we can have things like the ID, which is a string, not a string resource, just a string. We need to annotate this with primary key to tell room this is our primary ID, but we don't want to auto-generate it. So this should be false because we get these unique IDs from the API already. We have a title that we want to save with the book. We have a description, which is a nullable string. We do have an image URL, which can also be nullable. We have languages, which is a list of strings. We have authors. Well, authors, also list of string. First published year, which I think we don't even make use of. Let's add this here. Val ratings average is a nullable double. Val ratings count is a nullable integer. Val number pages median is a nullable integer. And lastly, the number of editions is an integer. And now when we have another such data model, just like a DTO, this is also now a data model that specifically couples this object to our local database framework, to room, since it also adds room-specific annotations, which is why this should definitely be a separate object here. Because we have that, we also do need another mapper. So just like we had a mapper here to transform our search book DTO to a normal book domain model. Now, if you want to have a book domain model and we want to save that in our database, we need a function that takes the domain model and maps this to our entity. So just book to book entity. And here we return a book entity. The ID stays ID. This, in the end, all stays the same here. We can just pass all that stuff as it is. The languages, authors, first published year, ratings average, ratings count, num pages median, and lastly, number editions. Like this. Rating count, this should be rating average rating, I called it there. Okay, so we now have a function to take a book, convert that to our database entity. So the next step when implementing a room database is always to come up with a so-called DAO, so a data access object. It's pretty much just an interface that outlines the functions that we need in order to interact with our database. So in the end, we just define the different queries that we would like to work with when it comes to the use of our database. This also goes in database. So a favorite book DAO, for example, will be an interface that we need to annotate with a DAO. And here we can then outline the functions we need. For example, a suspend function to upsert a book. So insert it if it doesn't exist, and if it exists, we update it instead. And the book here is simply of type book entity. We annotate this with upsert, and room will do the rest for us. Then apart from that, we need a function to actually fetch our books. So function get favorite books, for example, which will return a list of book entities now. And actually what we would like to have here is reactivity. So we want a function that always automatically triggers when we change something about this query, when we change something about the favorite book table by, for example, adding a new favorite, by deleting an existing one. So what we want is to wrap this in a Kotlin flow. This is something a room luckily supports. So thanks to this flow, we can observe this list of book entities, and it will always give us the most up-to-date list when something about our query changes. We do need to specify this query, of course. So how we want to fetch those books, that's now SQL, which goes in this query annotation, for which you can say select. I want to select everything, so all the fields, all the columns from our book. What is it? Book entity. How? There is no auto completion. Probably just book entity. And there's also no where condition because we just want to fetch all books from our table. This is not a suspend function here because